Hey everyone, welcome to the Piouspodium. It's your host, Nami Jimenez. Here we talk everything about apologetics, philosophy, and difficult questions in theology. I'm so excited that you're here listening and watching with us. Today we're going to be talking about perspectives, but we're going to continue to apply that into the realm of metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. And today we're going to talk about ethics, and I'm really excited about this because we wanted to find a multi-perspective view that lets us see the fullness of what is right and wrong according to a Christian view, which we understand that it's through perspectives, which reflects the Trinitarian nature of God. As we know, ethics is really the study of what is right and wrong, what is moral, what is immoral. It falls under axiology or value theory, which just talks about what we value, what we should value, and what we should or should not do. Another kind of sub-discipline of that value theory is like aesthetics. And so it's really cool because we're going to just look right now at ethics and kind of like the morality side of what is right and wrong. But keep it in mind, right? There are so many ways that we can use perspectives. And very particularly, we're going to look at some of the triads that John Frame uses in his work to try and give us different perspectives in understanding ethics, which I think is going to allow us to, one, really, like I said, define it in a Christian worldview, but two, also know how to pinpoint and see the failures of non-Christian philosophies in the field of ethics. So let's talk about these three perspectives. The first one is the normative perspective. So when John Frame talks about the normative perspective, he's talking about standards. He's talking about norms that kind of govern what is right or what is wrong. Now, when we look at it through non-Christian philosophy, what would be like the mirror or the doppelganger of that perspective is going to be something like deontological ethics in secular philosophy. And basically the same way in deontological ethics, what we see is we see high meta golden rules or meta ideas that govern what is right or wrong. Some examples of this are Immanuel Kant. He had a meta golden rule that he thought governed everything else that was morally good. Plato talks about this form of justice, this idea that kind of rules over all acts of justice and what is just on the earth. However, when we look at it through a Christian perspective, we understand that the normative, the deontological, is rooted in the commands of God. And it's more importantly, the ultimate standard is God's character himself. And God's character is the norm. It is the standard by which we can measure all acts to know if we're doing something that is good or if we're doing something that is evil. And what's great is that this is not something that is ambiguous to us. This is something that's seen through the commands, as I said, of God. It's seen through what he has revealed about himself through the Bible, through history, through the life of Jesus. We see that the meta-ethic or golden rule is his character and his commands for us. But what ends up happening, right, like I said, is that the non-Christian approach, the secular approach of deontological ethics elevates this approach or this one perspective above the rest and looks for transcendent norms, norms that are really high up and kind of have authority over the rest of moral sayings, moral truths, or moral actions. So the normative perspective is really important because I think that it's very easy, as I said in our last few episodes when we spoke about perspectives, to fall into reductionism. And when we fall into reductionism, what ends up happening is we take one perspective and we make it a god above all the rest. And if we're going to have the full understanding of ethics, we have to understand that the normative, the deontological, is just one aspect in part, but it doesn't have its fullness without the other two perspectives. So what's the second perspective? The second perspective is called the situational perspective. And this one, its contrasting doppelganger in secular philosophy is known as utilitarian ethics or teleological ethics. It's ethics and good that is kind of tied in together with what we get. There's a good that we're after. There's a instrumental purpose behind doing good acts. And so they're not just, right, this perspective, when we look at it through this Trinitarian, right, perspective, The normative is about what God gives us, the norms that he gives us, and it's found in what he says, and it's found in his character. But God also is the one who puts us in the world that we live in and the situations and contexts in how we're supposed to actually use it. He puts us in relation to humans to actually do these things. You know, we could think about so often, right, where you know it's the right thing to do, but it's the situation, right, that we have to use it in, that sometimes we need to apply the normative. We need to apply the standard. We have to look at, right, we have this common saying, and I call it a Christianese thing, right? What would Jesus do? That's a normative thing, but we're trying to take the normative and we're trying to apply it to a situation. And utilitarian ethics, right, in the secular version, tries to elevate this perspective above the rest, meaning that we kind of find only like the reason why we do things, right? What is good, what is moral, what we should value doing is the thing that gets us maybe what's beneficial to all of us. Or maybe the thing that produces the most good, the thing that produces the most happiness. These are different utilitarian ethics that have been proposed by different philosophers throughout time. They think that this is the way that we understand ethics. It's the way that we should live our lives, right? So in the situational perspective, right, when we understand it from God, God created the world and the situation comes from him, right? The world that we live in and the people that we're in relation to. And so in the world that we live in, it's also set by God himself, the situation, right? That when we obey his norms and his commands, it is beneficial to those and to those around us. So society flourishes, right? As an example, when we don't kill and we don't steal from others. We also don't feel guilty internally in our lives, and we can receive pleasure and blessings from God. It's not something that is just relational to ourselves. It's something that is relational in the context of the world that we live in. And God set it up like that. So he gives us the norm, but he's also setting up the situation for us. And that's that connection between the two. The third perspective, the final perspective, right, is in this triad, right, of perspectives, is what we call the existential perspective. And this perspective, it contrasts in secular philosophy to what we call existential ethics. The existential ethics and even the existential perspective to some degree emphasizes the personal consciousness of the person doing the act that is either good or bad. In this way, the existential is emphasizing that we are the ones who adopt the norms. We are the ones in situations that do to actually use them, right? These, what is moral and what is ethical isn't just this norm that's above that we can get through reason in the secular version or through God that he tells us through like the Bible and in his character. It's really more important than that. What it's saying is that those norms, what is ethical, doesn't truly have its power or force unless there are doers and actors of it who adopt those norms themselves. Now that's the connection, right, between the existential and the normative in a Christian approach. But we're going to talk right here really quickly about what happens then, right, when we take these normative, situational, existential perspectives and we elevate them and separate them from these other perspectives. One important thing to note before we move there, right, is that we understand in the existential perspective, the perspective that's Trinitarian in its approach, that we all have an internal conscious and we are the ones who adopt the norms. But we understand that there is still sin that can make us accept or deny God's norms, right? And this is really important because ethics now isn't something that is relativistic or subjective. What the existential perspective is trying to emphasize is that there is an internal factor within us, an existential, a personal aspect in ethics that can't be denied in the process of ethics. We can't relegate it, which again is what we're going to talk about. What happens when we relegate particular perspectives? Here are a few traps that we can fall in, right? When we allow reductionism to trick us into adopting one of these perspectives in ethics. So what happens, right, when a norm or the normative perspective is disconnected from persons, situations, the God who gave it to us? Here are some things that we might be asking, right? Why should we follow this norm? And it's really funny because I think it's so ingrained in our thinking to respond to something like, well, because if you do good, this X, Y, and Z, right? You're going to feel better about yourself. It feels good to do good. 2, you don't want to deal with guilt or a punishment if you do wrong. 3, we could say something like, it's beneficial to you or to others around you to treat others as you want to be treated. That's a normative rule that is in the Bible, and even some other people, maybe like in secular philosophy, might come up with that norm. But when it's disconnected from God, right? And when it's disconnected from the situation, that's the situational perspective that we're trying to bring up to justify following the norms. Let me explain that one more time here. When we say, right, why should I follow the norm? And we answer that question with those previous examples, because it's beneficial, because you're not going to have any punishment if you decide to do good and you avoid doing what's bad. When we do that, we are invoking a situational perspective that can't really be used if we're trying to be extremely strict to the normative perspective. We don't have any reasons to follow. There is an instrumental purpose to our norms. We have to have a reason to do them. And we don't have that if we disconnect the norm and the normative perspective, these transcendental things, and we elevate them way too high. We don't have a reason to not go for vengeance when someone does wrong to us. Without an existential, there is no guilty conscience that tells us not to go and do evil. There is no situation or relation to humans that we can take into perspective and take into account when making those decisions if we disconnect the norm from the situational and existential perspective. And likewise, when we take away when we adopt an ethics based on goals, like a utilitarian approach, right? Then all of a sudden, we can do anything for the sake of utility. We can do anything for happiness or common good. However, there's a problem here, right? Because when you say happiness, to do something for the end of happiness, for the goal of everyone being benefited, those are situational, instrumental reasons for you to do good, but you need a norm to define those very goals that you're trying to go after. This is the trick. This is how they presuppose, and they're all ingrained into one another, these perspectives. So we can't say that we want to do something, or what is correct is what produces common good, because we need to define common good normatively. We need a standard by which we can judge if we've actually reached it or not. So like the question is, how can we even define what is best or what is to the common good without a norm? So the situational is dependent on the normative, just as well as the normative is dependent on the situational. And finally here, the existential ethic, when it's separated, that perspective, when it's separated, there is no unified norms. There are conflicting ethics because it's all personal and subject to the person who is doing the acts, right? We generate our own meaning because there is no norm from God. There is no norm at all because there is no measure to be like, hey, I think you're a little off the rails on what is right or what is wrong. We can't do that because we need a measure. It's like saying, I don't think that's 6 feet apart. Well, you can't tell if there's not a ruler that can tell you what is 6 feet apart. And so the existential, right? Anything goes. That's literally what happens. Everyone might have something for their own benefit, and they can define that with their own norms, right? They can define it on their own, and they can throw away the situational. They don't have to care about the good for others. They don't have to care about the sake of what might happen to them in the future. Because again, that's an existential approach that's separated from the situational and the normative perspective. So it's really important to understand these three perspectives, because a lot of students are facing a lot of interesting, right, objections to what we have normally understood to be good or to be wrong. And in this season, I think it's so important that we are able to see the philosophies of this world, and we're able to see the ideologies that are under, the things that we study, and we're able to actually look at them and say like, hey, I see that you're only maybe exemplifying and emphasizing in an existential and a personal, right, thing, an adoption of a norm that's personal, but we're not fully putting into perspective the situational, or we aren't really asking where that norm has come from and if it's truly the norm that we want to accept. And I think that when we are able to do that, we're able to look at non-Christian approaches to philosophy and we're going to be able to see the common good, right? There are some deontological ethics that I think has some beautiful things for us. We're going to talk in an episode soon about the Stoics, and we're going to talk about how Stoicism has little pieces of common grace inside of them that we can adopt as good normative rules of thumb. However, those things are not superseded, or they do not exceed and reign above, separated from the situation and the existential. And that goes for the other perspectives as well. There are common grace truths, and we just have to be really, really careful that when we look at these other philosophies, when they exalt one perspective amongst the other. And I think it's so key that as we do that, a lot of students will be able to look at the arguments of what is right and what is wrong. And we're going to be able to see when it's missing the situational, when it's overemphasizing the existential, or when the norm isn't coming from God, and we can understand how to defend the positions of what a true Christian ethic is. And so then we could apply these perspectives to difficult subjects like abortion, difficult questions about homosexual marriage and homosexuality. We can take these rich perspectives and see the normative, see the situational, and see the existential, and how we can interact with these ideas and the very people who adopt these ideas. So I hope that this has been really helpful to you and to us, because like I said, when we exalt one perspective, we don't have a whole account of what is right. Meaning that when we see perspectives, we see how God and his nature is the source and the right lens to see ethics. We're going to be talking a lot more in depth about the history of ethics, seeing how each person who proposed an ethic or an ethical framework was either doing it deontologically, doing it emphasizing the situational, doing it emphasizing the existential, taking the good and disposing of the bad. And we're also going to be able to apply this to all the other fields of philosophy like metaphysics and epistemology. I really hope that this has been helpful to you. If you're watching on YouTube, I invite you to subscribe and like, share it to somebody. If you're listening to Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, please hit the follow so that you can hear our episodes that are releasing every single Monday. I hope to see you in our next episode. My name is Nehemias Jimenez. God bless.